Discussing what he calls the aporias of action, Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutical philosopher, considers a particularly intractable conundrum involving a chain of causes and effects. On the one hand, the search for an original cause located in a historical or natural phenomenon can, as it has been long known, go on indefinitely. Or, at least what is finally identified is none other than the prime mover hypothesized by Aristotle. But on the other hand, the search for a human agent to whom responsibility for putting into motion the same chain of causes and events can be assigned, that search is invariably much shorter. A human agent, collective or individual, can be blamed for the fall of Rome, the gods, or praised for bringing the Soviet empire of evil to its knees. Ronald Reagan, in case you haven't guessed. The aporia might be explained, or rather explained away, by arguing that the two different results are the product of two distinct paradigms, one of quasi-physical causality, the other one of human agency. I am not, however, concerned here with the possible solution to this philosophical conundrum, but with a parallel in the study of history. Transposed to the historian's field, such questions have tended to revolve around the issue of origins or precedents or precursors. The reference to the latter, to precedents and precursors, already signals a weakening of the interest in the causal link. It might not be possible, for example, to demonstrate that Charlemagne's empire was a distant cause of the creation of today's united Europe. But as a precedent, this case shows that somewhat similar ideas and practices could emerge in the widely different circumstances of the 8th century. History is not only about continuities, about chains of causes and effects, but also about discontinuities, hiatuses, falls, and reinventions. The work of Michel Foucault and his colleague, the historian Paul Venn, has highlighted the perils of focusing on false continuities over the longue durée. But the possibility of a history of the different incarnations of practices that fulfill the same broad social functions, the possibility of that history remains open and, I believe, sheltered from Foucault and Venn's criticism, as long as that approach doesn't postulate that historical practices from different contexts are essentially identical or the same. Take this example, the history of urbanization includes the early urban site of Mohenjo-Daro in present-day Pakistan from the 3rd millennium BC, even though the site was abandoned in the 2nd millennium BC. Continuity is not the main issue here, although questions of transmission and diffusions remain important. Rather, our interest focuses on the different historical possibilities of a shared human nature. The 3rd millennium BC Indus Valley incarnation of urban life, which it might be interesting to compare and contrast with medieval and modern incarnations of urbanism. Similarly, philosophy as an academic discipline might be said to have emerged in Germany in the 18th century, as Richard Rorty has argued, but most histories of Western philosophical thought take 6th century BC Greece as their starting point. Now, judged by a good deal of recent scholarship, modernity would seem to escape this general rule. Its history seems remarkably short. Thank you. The history of modernity seems remarkably short in a good deal of recent scholarship. For example, the editor of a 4-volume compendium of scholarship on modernity in the Critical Concepts series, you might know that series, rebukes the call by cultural historians and scholars of the Middle Ages for a longer history of modernity going back or going beyond the last 200 years. His offhand mention of such heretical views, indeed there is not even the suggestion of a counter-argument based on historical data, this kind of offhand mention might be interpreted as the anxiety of a scholar attempting to demarcate a territory free of unwanted intrusions by other kinds of specialists. But more fundamentally, it signals a lack of interest in history, or at least a lack of interest in the longue durée. But at least this multi-volume anthology on modernity includes the 19th century, and since Max Weber's work cannot be dismissed offhand, it also goes back on occasion to the 16th century. But much recent scholarship that approaches the problematic of modernity from a sociological perspective equates modernity with the post-war period, or at best with the 20th century. While Weber and Norbert Elias practiced historical sociology. In recent sociologies of modernity, the historical is dropped. And the phenomenon is not limited to sociology. In a recent January 2011 forum in the journal French Historical Studies, a forum edited by Daniel Smail, 4 historians discuss what they call the telescoping of history, the compression of history, or the flattening of historical time. All history is becoming more modern in the sense that it's limited to the last 200 years or so, as if the period before the moment of birth or origin of this or that idea or practice was totally irrelevant. Volumes that trace the history of political ideas or cultural practices seem to reach back no further than the Enlightenment. Not that their authors would necessarily contend that, for example, introspective writing does not have a history before the 18th century. They would probably agree that it does, but nevertheless they feel entitled to leave that history out of the picture. Now, perhaps the term telescoping does not capture forcefully enough the effects of this move towards locating origins in the last 200 years. Taken to the extreme, this view amounts to the exclusion of most of human history from the dialogue through which we form our historical understanding of the present society, indeed the historical understanding of ourselves. In this view, we can adequately understand ourselves as a society without drawing on the experiences of the centuries up to 1800 or 1700, or almost perhaps, because there is indeed one way in which the history before remains useful, and that is for drawing a sharp contrast with the advances of the modern age. The medieval period immediately preceding European modernity is a good example. 1,000 years of history are often presented as a static age, displaying essentially the same cultural characteristics circa 500 as circa 1500, or at least displaying them from the perspective of the sharp contrast that is drawn with modernity. Whatever change is acknowledged to have occurred during the medieval period remains nevertheless circumscribed by this thesis of a radical cultural difference between the world before and after the advent of modernity, which is to say, the birth of enlightenment most of the times. Now, studying the Middle Ages is important precisely because its otherness offers us a term of comparison for understanding our modernity, not unlike the way in which anthropology proposes an understanding of the West through the comparison with the other, with non-Western cultures. But studying the otherness of medieval society is also useful as a way of grasping its transformation into modernity, and implicitly the potential for change that existed in medieval culture. And I think it is this crucial aspect, the capacity of medieval culture to engender historical change, that becomes overlooked if one starts from the premise of a modern society, post-1800, let's say, that is radically different, I emphasize radically different from what preceded it. Modernity has for long been a value-laden notion, but it seems to have also turned into a cherished possession, a unique object whose aura would be somehow diminished if similar historical artifacts from previous ages would be placed next to it. And I think this is the point where modernity's self-description, which since 1500 years ago has involved a real contrast with the culture of the preceding period, the self-description begins to overshadow the historian's duty to examine critically their object of study. The researcher's cultural identity and the self-description of the modern culture in which the researcher is embedded become locked in a vicious circle. The circularity becomes evident if we consider a factor perpetuating the myths of modernity, namely the academic division of labor between medievalists and modernists, each absorbed in their own precisely delineated fields. This division is itself the product of broader cultural trends that have defined our modernity as quite unlike anything that has preceded it, that has taken place before. At times, our historical discourse reproduces quite uncritically the agenda of Enlightenment thinkers who are forging their modern identity by rejecting the cultural heritage of the preceding medieval era. Let's take this example, as Susan Reynolds has shown in her pioneering work, Thieves and Vassals. 20th century scholarly ideas about feudalism perpetuate the cultural schemas contrived by early modern writers who are trying to paint a disparaging picture of the tyrannical feudal society of the past, unlike the modern world that they were building. So following Reynolds' book and other works inspired by it, feudalism is now a discredited notion among many medievalists. Nevertheless, it remains ingrained in modernist perspective on medieval society. More examples and more relevant for the history of modernity can be adduced. The 12th and 13th centuries represented one of the greatest ages of reason, ratio, and this has been shown by Richard Southern's research on medieval humanism. This was an age in which the individual's position in society was affirmed, and an optimistic outlook about the future of society spread throughout urban centers. It was a somewhat limited movement, I admit. Now, this aspect, however, is rarely evoked today outside of medievalist circles. Recall this introduction to modernity in the Critical Concept series. The Enlightenment status as the first age of reason in history can thus go unchallenged. The Enlightenment's own version of modernity becomes normative, or it can become normative, as earlier modernization efforts, great and small, half-achieved or perhaps partial, become victims of a paradigm built on the contrast between developments before and after the 18th century. In this paradigm, late medieval transformations in the social imaginary, which include the spread of the vernacular and of pragmatic literacy, the valorization of work, what is known as laicization or secularization, all these developments in the late Middle Ages remain at best relevant for the prehistory of modernity. The prehistory of modernity. The history of modernity is allegedly only 2 or 3 centuries old. Unlike the history of urbanism or moral philosophy, which I mentioned before, the history of modernity does not admit significant precedents. But another view is possible, thanks to research over the last 30 years, and I want to sketch its main parameters in the final part of this paper. To understand this perspective, we need to clarify our insights about what modernity is. Clearly, it is not simply a historical age. If you take that view, nothing of what I've said thus far is any longer intelligible. So clearly, it's not simply a historical age. That would be a simple but unsatisfying answer. Consider that in both scholarly and popular conceptions, modernity stands for more than just a period. It stands for a cluster of societal changes. But here we encounter a difficulty, how to define these changes. Now, modernity is frequently characterized in all but its own terms. Let me explain what I mean by that. Oftentimes, it is as if when we say modernity, we really mean to say industrialization, or industrialization plus mass culture, plus the nation state, and so on and so forth. Would it not be simpler then to just say industrialization, if this is what we mean, to talk about the industrial and pre-industrial ages? Modernity is defined by aggregating developments as diverse and perhaps separate as the bureaucratic state, industrialization, demographic growth, print culture, and recently TV and internet culture. The list can go on with the so-called risk society, or the abstract systems in which we increasingly place our trust, which have been identified by sociologists in recent years as defining modernity. Now, doubtless, these are all important phenomena, but they do not tell us what modernity is about in the proper sense in which this idea has been in use for more than 1500 years. The history of the notions modern, modernitas, modernité, is not just a matter of etymology. Rather, the concept associated with the term, with the words, has been deployed in different historical contexts in remarkably similar ways. There is a salient central meaning to it ever since its first recorded use around the year 500 by Pope Gelasius, who contrasted older church regulations with his own novel legislation, and then again the term was used by Cassiodorus, who distinguished between the Roman Empire of the past and the saecula moderna, the modern times in which he was living. The sense of cultural change, of moving beyond tradition and into new territory, is evident in later cases when the concept was brought to the fore, during the so-called Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th century, and notably in the 12th century humanist movement that began around the cathedral schools, the future universities, a movement that I've already mentioned in this presentation. Modernity was a fundamental idea for the 12th century Renaissance, as humanists like Pierre Abelard styled themselves moderni, meaning the men of now, from the Latin adverb modo. Now, recently, presently, they define themselves in contradistinction with the thinkers of yesteryear. They also call themselves hodierni, the men of today, from hodie, today. Interestingly, their modernitas was not dismissive of the past and did not reject tradition as a whole, unlike the modernity of the 20th century. The confidence in human energies and in an open future, a characteristic of medieval humanism, recognized an important debt to the cultural legacy of earlier generations, and this debt is epitomized in Bernard of Chartres' metaphor, dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Having survived the demographic and social disasters that cast a darker cultural mood over the 14th century, the intellectual legacy of 12th century humanism turned out quite influential in the genesis of the Italian Renaissance. At the end of the Middle Ages, the affirmation of the individual, both as knowing subject and as an agent acting in society, was more significant than in the 12th century, when it had been circumscribed largely by intellectuals' circles and intellectuals' reflections. The relation between late medieval social transformations and the emergence of early modernity, of the early modernity of the 16th to 18th centuries, is a promising topic of research. Important suggestions about the modernity of the Middle Ages have already been made by medievalists like Jean-Claude Schmitt and Jacques Le Goff. Now, in contrast with the vision of modernity which I have presented and critiqued in this paper, a different paradigm of modernity has been recently proposed by historians and social scientists who conduct research on multiple modernities, the emphasis on the plural, multiple modernities. This perspective disputes the thesis, challenges the thesis of a single modernity that spread from Western Europe to the rest of the world, and on the contrary draws attention to local contributions to modernization across Eurasia, and therefore draws attention to the plurality of paths to modernity. It also entails a view of early modernity that reflects social transformations since the 12th century. And here, the multiple modernitist perspective meets the recent work of medievalists. Importantly, the definition of modernity in the multiple modernitist perspective centers on the valorization of human agency and the idea of the open future, the topics that Nadezhda has talked about just now. So this idea of human agency is central for the definition of modernity. And this is, in my opinion, certainly a step forward, because such a definition is a historically informed definition of our analytical construct, modernity. It resonates with both Enlightenment and medieval notions of change. Now, the geographical plurality of paths to modernity opens up an intriguing possibility. Thank you. An intriguing possibility on the chronological plane. It suggests that we can grasp the modernity of the later Middle Ages as a movement with its own dynamic and its own cultural logic, one of several periods of social innovation and modernization in history. Now, in this particular case, the modernity of the later Middle Ages, there are both mutations and continuities as regards its relation with the succeeding early modern period. As I have already mentioned, there is an important, albeit complex, relation between late medieval social changes and the emergence of European modernity. But at other moments in history, we can identify modernization movements, periods of accelerated social change informed by new ideas of human agency. Modernization movements whose legacy was not enduring. Yet they remain interesting, I think, for anyone who wants to study modernity, not as a time period, but as a historical process. Because these examples tell us of the different ways of thinking about social change and the different ways of imagining an open future to be achieved through different new forms of social mobilization. Such examples provide genuine historical terms of comparison for Europe's classical modernity of the last 2 centuries. They are not just material for a rough and ready contrast, which in my opinion obfuscates more than it illuminates. Whether the word modern and its derivatives were used in the self-definition of such cultural movements is ultimately less important. because similar attitudes and ideas can be expressed by many different expressions. Thus, the history of modernity can go beyond the first recorded use of the term modern, circa 500, as long as the historian is attentive to the substance of different visions and programs of social change. And for example, Paul Venn writes in a recent book about the modernity, in his recent book writes about the modernity of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, whose Christian project has had wide-ranging consequences, as we now know. One can encounter modernity movements even before the Common Era. And this means that to the question, how old is the history of modernity, any answer will have to be provisional. Yet my first response is to say older than the 18th century. Thank you very much.